you wander through the carefully restored streets of Williamsburg today, the city's charm, with its flawless beauty and timeless appeal, might make it easy to believe this is how things appeared long ago. However, if you had lived here decades before the American Revolution, you would have encountered a different reality. Walking along the town's muddy streets and past weather-worn buildings, you would have been acutely aware of the colony's slowly failing economy. This decline affected not just the poor and the middle class, but also the gentry. As imperial overreach increased, the mental health of the colonists was suffering. In the midst of these conditions, magnified by the French and Indian War and a slew of new taxes, the agitation of the people was growing more intense than ever. One man's downfall emerged from this era, and soon swept stories of scandal, deceit, and murder across the colony. A landowner, businessman, and politician who once lived in Williamsburg was involved in a killing that took place in Virginia. His trial, to be held in the city, soon became the talk of the town. The story of John Chiswell's final years were marked by desperation, anger, deceptive politics, and shady dealings, ultimately culminating in a series of unexpected twists that took everyone by surprise. In the lead-up to the drama that unfolded, another transgression indirectly connected to the crime was revealed. The largest financial scandal the colony had ever seen. Before diving into the details of the murder, understanding Chiswell's early life, business ventures, and the backstory of his gradual decline will help paint a clearer picture of what might have partly driven him to make the drastic decision to take another man's life. In the following episode, I'll begin with a look at Chiswell's inherited home at Scotchtown Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, before heading into Williamsburg to locate his residence still standing on Francis Street in the city today. While there, I'll also explore some of the inner streets, back alleyways, and key landmarks found throughout Williamsburg to further unravel the mysteries and parallel plots of my investigation. Later, I'll set out on another road trip away from Williamsburg in hopes of locating the actual 18th century tavern where the murder took place. Finally, I return to the city, to a somber site east of the Capitol building where Chiswell was to be incarcerated while awaiting trial. But to officially begin this story, understanding the condition of the colony is vital to setting the stage. There was once a time in Williamsburg and throughout the colonies when England's firm grip on colonial trade was greatly felt by the people. A series of laws put in place by the Crown complicated the cycle of importing and exporting goods. This system, governed by shifting regulations over time, controlled the flow of commerce both within the colonies and internationally. These were known as the Navigation Acts. In broad terms, they affected various segments of American colonial society, from farmers who relied on exporting their raw materials for income, as well as shopkeepers and skilled trade artisans who depended on selling products and services to earn a living. Before the Acts, colonists were accustomed to freely selling their materials and goods to other European countries. However, with the Navigation Acts in place and their grip tightening with further revisions over time, the decrees meant they were only able to import and export by way of English merchants only. The Crown also mandated that all items shipped to and from the colonies had to be transported exclusively on English or colonial ships. Tobacco, sugar, rice, cotton, molasses, furs, iron, and other goods that fueled England's wealth and power were exported from the colonies. England would then process the materials, turn out goods, impose heavy taxes on them, and sell them back to the colonies at inflated prices. Although some resorted to smuggling to continue in their trade efforts, the acts were designed to force the colonists into complete dependency on English manufactured products. These economic limitations greatly agitated the people and eventually contributed to the outbreak of war during the American Revolution. Amid the many struggles and hardships of the time, stories of crime involving murder, financial fraud, greed, and abuse of power were woven into the fabric of history. Scandals that later generations can study and reflect upon. During a recent stay in Williamsburg, I realized the story of John Chiswell and his decision to commit murder serves as a stark reminder of how desperation and corruption often leads to tragic consequences. A young John Chiswell, his last name pronounced with a silent W, was born around 1710 and was raised by his parents in Hanover County, Virginia, spending most of his younger years growing up at Scotchtown Plantation, the future home of Patrick Henry. His father, Charles Chiswell, was a tobacco planter and land speculator, someone who would buy up land from the Crown at low cost and resold it to small investors. A business model that was highly profitable to many of the political elites in the 18th century, including well-known founding fathers like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and others. During his youth, Chiswell might have recognized his father's ties to the ruling class, connections which helped to associate their family name with wealth and politics. After his father's death in April of 1736, Chiswell inherited Scotchtown Plantation at the ripe age of 26 years old, and not long after, he joined the local Hanover County militia and was named colonel. And like his father before him, who once served as the Virginia Clerk of Court in 1706 inside the first Capitol building in Williamsburg, Chiswell Jr. also established ties with upper echelon figures of his time. First, by marrying into the prominent Randolph family of Virginia, taking as his wife the daughter of William Randolph II, Elizabeth Randolph. Her father and her brother, Peter Randolph, were both members of the Governor's Council. In the years that followed, John and Elizabeth had 4 daughters. One of them, Susanna Chiswell, around the age of 19, became the third wife of a powerful and well-known political figure in Williamsburg, whose career in Virginia politics spanned over 38 years. While still living at Scotchtown, life for Chiswell and his family were on the move, and by 1742, he found himself representing Hanover County in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. Chiswell, a well-known gentleman planter in Scotchtown, was now a politician. A decade or so later, he would move to Williamsburg, continuing life as a Burgess while representing Hanover County.
Chiswell's home in Williamsburg sits along Francis Street. I'm here in front of it right now.
It seemed like the time he spent now living in the capital city lit the entrepreneurial fires within him, and by 1752, he caught the bug of the booming iron industry and was operating a furnace near Fredericksburg, Virginia. In the same year, he also tapped into his network of upper-class colleagues, partnering with local physician Dr. George Gilmer in a business venture.
Chiswell once had flourishing business endeavors, including his iron furnace business, as well as he teamed up with physician George Gilmer in 1752 and became co-owner of the Raleigh Tavern, which is right here beside me.
By 1756, he showed few signs of slowing down and was now representing Williamsburg in the House of Burgesses.
And here I am at the front side of the Raleigh Tavern. Gilmer and Chiswell's tavern that they co-owned. Let's go up here on the porch and get a closer look. So it does seem as if Chiswell leveraged those he knew best to go after other types of business opportunities he was interested in, like here at the Raleigh.
Life in the city as a politician allowed Chiswell to forge close bonds with many elite political figures. But none of his connections were more powerful than Speaker of the House, John Robinson.
I guess some could say Chiswell would have been better off stopping his business ventures here, as it does seem his financial issues through the years became more pronounced as his story evolved.
Was Chiswell's hunger for wealth and status, driven by his desire to uphold a high society lifestyle and reputation? Was this his reasoning for juggling multiple business endeavors and financial obligations? Maybe so, as soon he decided to push westward into the thick of the Virginia wilderness in pursuit of exposing other profitable ores to mine for. It is said that in his search, he stumbled upon a tribe of Native Americans deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the run and desperate to flee from them, he managed to find a small cave to hide in. Inside the cave, now known as Chiswell's Hole, he spotted some curious rock formations that appeared to hold dense ore concentrations. Much to his delight, it was later confirmed to be lead. Eager to tell those closest to him about his discovery, he let planter and politician William Byrd III, the Royal Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Francis Fauquier, and Speaker of the House of Burgesses, John Robinson, in on the details. Eventually, with their financial investment and support, Chiswell formed a lead mining operation to begin extracting from the metal-bearing outcroppings he had found. Around December of 1759, his bond with Robinson would grow even stronger, with Robinson marrying Chiswell's daughter, Susanna. With this firm family connection and Robinson's considerable wealth, his growing money troubles would soon benefit. Back at the lead mine, early attempts to exploit the ore weren't successful, and with the growing strain felt in the colony's tobacco economy due to the rising cost of the French and Indian War, Chiswell's insatiable hunger to turn a profit elsewhere was heightened. In 1760, to help offset some of his debt, he reluctantly sold Robinson his property at Scotchtown Plantation. He racked up even more debt as he continued to borrow money from Robinson and those closest to him. And although I couldn't determine the exact reason why, his continued obsession with the mines would see him travel to London to have his lead ore further examined. Shortly after, to ensure maximum output at the worksite, Chiswell is said to have hired and brought over a foreman and a group of Welsh miners to Virginia. At the mines, they worked in conjunction with a vast number of enslaved workers. These men were highly knowledgeable and experienced in mining operations, but the work they did was grueling. When the French and Indian War finally ended, the colony's debts were at an all-time high, and over time, Colonel John Chiswell, with little cash in hand and facing the pressures of mounting debt from trying to keep his mining business afloat, realized his financial situation was beginning to take a toll on him. With his business pursuits flourishing at various points over the years, the reality was that under the radar, his enterprises were mostly struggling. In those days, the colony's economic condition declined, and there were major shortages of available money, which made it difficult for the colonists to pay their taxes, settle debts, and keep the economy growing. The colonies often overprinted paper money for various financial purposes during the French and Indian War, but it wasn't always backed by gold or silver, which led to inflation and a drop in value. As a result, a lot of planters couldn't pay back the debts they had, as their only hope of repayment relied on selling their crops, selling off land, or selling those they enslaved. Many frustrated merchants hoped to take legal action to recover what was owed to them, but their hopes diminished when Virginia temporarily closed its courts in retaliation to the Stamp Act controversy. One of the final blows to Chiswell's hopes for financial recovery through profits made at his mines came in the form of a proclamation put forth by King George III in 1763. It stated lands west of the Appalachian Mountains were preserved for the indigenous people, with laws ordering white settlers to remove themselves from the lands. This all but crippled Chiswell's lead mining operations as they fell west of the proclamation line. He was on the verge of collapse. Like any concerned family member would do if able to, Chiswell's son-in-law, Williamsburg's highly respected Speaker of the House and appointed Treasurer of the colony, John Robinson, might have felt obligated to help him out with his money issues. But his support went well beyond the boundaries of family members deep in debt, stemming outward to many gentlemen of Virginia who were experiencing fiscal difficulties too. To assist them, he began secretly lending out large sums of public money to members of the Assembly and others, but soon realized that his debt to the public had grown so large it might be soon uncovered. One solution to avoid his corruption being found out was openly described to the public in the Virginia Gazette, a scheme devised by Robinson and some planter burgesses who were facing bankruptcy. Robinson supported the plan, which meant borrowing gold from English investors. Part of the loan would pay off the paper money used to afford the cost of war, and the other portion of the borrowed gold would back the loans given to planter burgesses who owned land but were in debt, with a 5% interest on the money they borrowed and a 14-year tax on tobacco exports, which would help pay off the interest on the total loan amount. This gave rich and powerful landowners who dominated the tobacco trade more time to settle their debts, and Robinson would be able to recover the public money he had secretly lent to them. The colony, however, would end up indirectly bearing the burden of the plan. One of the members of the governor's council rebuked the scheme, eloquently remarking,
"To tax people that are not in debt, to lend to those that are, is highly unjust. It is in fact to tax the honest, frugal, industrious man, in order to encourage the idle, the profligate, the extravagant, and the gamester."
But the politically swayed and connected gentlemen planners continued in their efforts to push the bill through the House, only to face further pushback by newly appointed Burgess member Patrick Henry, thrusting into his first ever, firmly pitched rebuttal of their scheme from within the House of Burgesses. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in his recollection of memories from the debate, Henry had stated,
"What, sir? Is it proposed then to reclaim the spendthrift from his dissipation and extravagance by filling his pockets with money?"
Despite being rigorously disputed, it passed the House, only to be later shot down by the Council. Robinson's conflict with Patrick Henry resurfaced during debates regarding the Stamp Act, with Robinson accusing Henry of treasonous acts against the king.
Or my fellow burgesses, I ask your pardon as a junior member. I would show my loyalty to His Majesty to the last drop of my blood. But this assembly has the sole right to lay taxes upon the inhabitants of this colony. It is well known that Julius Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, may George III profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of
it. Aside from shortages of gold and silver, the cost of war, debt, and credit issues, the cash crunch in the colony was worsened by the circulated paper money that was intended to serve as a short-term solution. This added to the colony's debt problem, as it represented loans that had to be repaid later. The paper money also had an expiration date on it, and the government hoped this would encourage people to pay their taxes with it before it became worthless and expired. The consensus was to avoid inflation. If the people paid their taxes, it would reduce the debt and limit the amount of paper money going around. And once the money returned to the government accounts, by special instruction in the law, Robinson was supposed to burn it, but he never did. Robinson, well known and held in high regard by many, was obviously willing to explore deceptive methods to provide financial relief to those in desperate need. In the final decade of his life, his decision to embezzle treasury funds and secretly lend money to political peers, supporters, and friends who were in distress, including his father-in-law, Colonel John Chiswell, would soon be realized. Most of the people that borrowed from him, however, never repaid their loans during his lifetime, and much of the loans he had given out came from none other than the collected paper money issued during the war. Money Robinson was supposed to have destroyed. Could their debts to him have motivated his misuse of funds in an effort to temporarily enhance his influence in the House of Burgesses? And was the cash Chiswell borrowed from Robinson partly driven by the failure of his lead mining operation, but also due to the financial strain brought on by the Stamp Act? On a late evening in May of 1766, Robinson died. It wasn't until his death that his financial crimes were revealed. The treasury accounts of the colony showed that he distributed personal loans totaling over 100,000 pounds, equivalent to millions of dollars today. He also failed to deposit funds collected by tax collectors. It was the largest extortion of public funds ever seen at the time. With Robinson's death, Chiswell must have further realized that But not only was the king's proclamation hurting his lead mining operations, but his son-in-law's passing meant a key source of private financial assistance was officially severed. This signaled further misfortune for him, as by this point, he was nearly broke. Fresh off the heels of unraveling the money scandal of John Robinson and learning how it intersected with the slow erosion of the John Chiswell crime saga, we set out from the historic area in an attempt to locate the old tavern where the murder took place.
Right, so we are getting real close now. We're about a mile away from Old Tavern Road where the tavern is. So getting close. Right up here on the left it should be, according to the GPS. This is it. Just need to figure out how we can get in here and get a closer look at the old tavern. Definitely on the back roads of Virginia. Kind of in no man's land to make this happen. Let's see if we can pull over here and read this sign real quick. Here it is. It's Mosby's Tavern. Benjamin Mosby operated a tavern on this site as early as 1741 in what was then Cumberland County. In 1749, at the formation of Cumberland County, this tavern served as its courthouse. It is on private property, so don't want to go onto their land here, but let's see if we can get a little closer angle by the Mosby Tavern signage hanging here. So good news here, I just talked to the owner, Don, of Mosby Tavern, and he just gave me clearance to go into his driveway and get a closer look of Mosby Tavern. So we're gonna actually drive through the entrance here. He notified his wife that we're gonna be coming in and get a closer look. There it is. Make sure the van doesn't hurt these trees. Look at this. This is the place of the murder scene. And there it is.
On a late afternoon on Tuesday, June 3rd, 1766, after a probable stressful day of hard work, ducking cover to avoid being seen on the lands of his restricted mines, Chiswell and a few of his men on horseback left the site and headed back towards home. Hungry, thirsty, and looking to take a load off during their return travel, passing through Cumberland County, Virginia, they stopped into Ben Mosby's Tavern. Here, an ill-fated decision to take a man's life led to what was expected to be the murder trial of the century. The place where Colonel John Chiswell's temper might have finally gotten the best of him. On that day inside Mosby's, voices were heightened, opinions were shouted, and the close-quartered layout inside the tavern created a crowded atmosphere. The story, known for its handful of eyewitness accounts detailing how things went down, regardless of the most accurate depiction, couldn't stretch too far from the realities of most any drunken dispute. Robert Rutledge, an English merchant who was most likely intoxicated and knew of Chiswell prior to his visit, got into an argument with him. Whether it can be said Chiswell was belligerently exclaiming the potential value of his high-dollar minerals, or if he was shouting out his frustrations, over the king's latest order, which stunted his business operations. Rutledge didn't take kindly to the profanity he was using during his outbursts. Multiple accounts of what happened that day were printed in the October 10th, 1766 Virginia Gazette. But what they all describe, more or less, is that in the dim confines of the tavern, two men who had seemed to get along initially during their visit to Mosby Tavern eventually got into a scuffle. One deposition described a scene where Rutledge, who had been drinking at the tavern nearly all day, abruptly expressing his disapproval of Chiswell's words, telling him to stop swearing and talking as you do among good company. In the midst of the room's flickering candlelight, the conversation quickly got heated and out of hand. Chiswell, with his perceived gentleman reputation, many knowing him as a wealthy elite loyalist, may have simply seen Rutledge beneath his social stature and merely unworthy of aiming belittling words his way. In a fit of anger, Chiswell yelled back, "Don't you ever swear?" and lashed out at Rutledge, calling him a fool. Further words were exchanged, and Chiswell's assault continued, calling Rutledge a Scottish rebel and a Presbyterian fellow, accusing him of being a villain who came to Virginia to cheat and defraud men of their property. With the argument intensifying inside Mosby Tavern, Rutledge resorted to his tankard of wine and is said to have thrown it at Chiswell's face, as recalled in multiple testimonies. This infuriated Chiswell, and various accounts mention he returned fire with a bowl of rum. During the 17th and 18th century, codes of conduct that dealt with honoring oneself in society during an unexpected fit of contention meant if a man was insulted, he could elect to fight to restore his honor. If the offended party demanded a challenge and the recipient apologized, it would end the conflict and honor was restored right then and there. If they refused, they agreed upon the weapon of choice and doled it out amongst each other to regain the respect they sought. Although there's no word of this being the proposed scenario at the crime scene at Mosby Tavern, it's indeed an interesting consideration regarding the encounter that took place inside this 18th century watering hole. In the thick of the argument, Chiswell demanded his sword be brought to him at once by his hesitant servant. He fired off words of warning to Rutledge and others, repeatedly demanding to have him removed from the room at once or face the consequences. Rutledge, lost in a haze of intoxication and probably fueled by adrenaline, refused to leave. One final attempt to defuse the scene saw another patron of the tavern attempt to escort Rutledge to the rear door. But as the altercation and verbal assaults continued to be aggressively exchanged between them, one side of the story states, Rutledge pulled away and moved towards Chiswell with arms raised to ease tension. But already having his weapon drawn to intimidate Rutledge into leaving, Chiswell stepped forward and drove his sword straight through the chest of Rutledge, killing him without remorse. One onlooker claimed Chiswell said, "He is dead and I killed him. I will surrender myself to the governor." Chiswell's side of the story explained it was an accident, with Rutledge being drunk and stumbling as he approached him, falling onto the sword to meet his fate. Other unverified accounts claim at the climax of the crime, Chiswell told his servant to clean his blade as he sat and pondered what happened over a drink. Shortly after the murder, he was hauled off to the county jail by the local justice of the peace in Cumberland County, before being taken to the public jail to await trial. As the story of the murder began to circulate, questions and rumors surfaced about what really took place at the tavern. Did Chiswell murder Rutledge in cold blood, or was it truly an accident fueled by alcohol and bad tempers? Back at the Capitol, the people of Williamsburg were flooded with various descriptions of the events that took place. But soon, yet another surprise development would afflict them with confusion at the onset of the trial that was to come. Upon his extradition, it was here where Chiswell was headed. He would have spent his days incarcerated under harsh conditions at the public jail in Williamsburg, just a short walk from the Capitol building he once served in. Shackled and confined in a cold, dark prison cell would have been a far cry from his typical way of life, especially compared to living in his nearby home on Francis Street in the city. If convicted, he would surely face death by the gallows. But en route from Cumberland County to Williamsburg to face his imprisonment, 3 judges he knew intervened during his transport. 2 of them were business associates of Chiswell, William Byrd III, his partner at the lead mines, and Presley Thornton, a colleague in business. Without speaking to any eyewitnesses or conducting a thorough review of the evidence presented by the examining court, evidence that initially led to his bail being refused and ordered him to the public jail while awaiting trial, Chiswell's allies were attempting to throw him a lifeline. Soon, they consulted George Wythe and 2 other distinguished lawyers in Williamsburg on the prospect of bail. With the reliability of 2 eyewitness accounts, they felt it was enough credible testimony to advise in granting it. Both statements claimed Chiswell wasn't even drunk, and it was Rutledge, the only one intoxicated. In the midst of his drunkenness, accidentally stumbling forward into Chiswell's blade during the altercation. A determination that was likely swayed probably wouldn't have been suggested in cases involving lower status citizens. But they did warn if he fled upon release and didn't appear for trial, the hefty amount of bail money put up would be forfeited. At the bond hearing, the judges sided with Chiswell's version of the incident and he was granted bail, allowing him to avoid the public prison and await trial at his home in Williamsburg. The first of its kind, as the laws of the land stated, bail could not be given to anyone involved in a homicide. The actions of the General Court and the legal advice given by some of Williamsburg's most respected attorneys made it seem laws were being circumvented to fit Chiswell's narrative, especially when the depositions used to determine his bail were later believed to be false. The people were furious, and the case ignited public outrage. Awaiting trial in the comfort of his home on Francis Street, Chiswell would have frequently noticed large gatherings of angry protesters outside as he anxiously peered out the window. Many believed that it was his supposed wealth, friends, and close political connections in the capital city that might have been helping him engineer a way to escape justice. As the long weeks dragged by, no one then or now can truly understand the extent of the mental and physical pressure he must have felt due to his failing business ventures financial difficulties, the recent death of his son-in-law John Robinson, and the controversial murder trial was fast approaching. As the date of the trial grew closer, the city would have been eagerly anticipating what was to come. Soon, the people would know the fate of Colonel John Chiswell. Many frustrated by the favoritism that was shown to him, which ultimately revealed that a gentleman landowner with status, well affiliated with wealthy, top-tier officials in the colony, can sidestep legal boundaries at any means necessary to bypass their wrongdoings. Corruption that was unveiled throughout the months leading up to the murder trial, but also seen in the surprising financial scandals that were unmasked shortly after the death of John Robinson a few months earlier. Chiswell's day of reckoning, however, was finally within reach. But on October 15, 1766, just a short time before the murder trial was set to take place, a shocking discovery came to light. On the first floor room of Chiswell's home on Francis Street in Williamsburg, his lifeless body was found. The cause of death resulted in even further controversy. The coroner stated he died of nervous fits, which resulted in a constant uneasiness of the mind, taking his own life due to the stress of the pending trial and his fear of being found guilty and sentenced to die. Others claimed conspiracy due to the timing of events and felt that those closest to him were covering for him and he was actually on the Atlantic sailing back to England. The family members and those closest to Robert Rutledge, the man he murdered at Mosby Tavern, were deeply suspicious and continued pressing for the truth behind his unexpected death. Mysteriously, despite all that was involved and the drama that had taken place over the months, Chiswell's story only earned him a short obituary listing in the Virginia Gazette that was nestled amongst a list of congested court proceedings. Due to the strong possibility of him taking his own life, Chiswell was denied a burial at the cemetery at Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg. This too would present difficulties and fueled further controversy. It was decided by his daughter Susanna Chiswell that his burial would take place back at Scotchtown. As the funeral procession arrived, members of Robert Rutledge's family and others were gathered outside. To prove his death, they demanded the coffin to be opened. Inside, it revealed the final traces of a life now distant. But was it Chiswell? Highly suspicious and unsure, due to the aged and fragile condition of the deceased lying inside, the family demanded the body be confirmed by a relative who knew him well. In the tense moments that followed, as onlookers closely watched the examination, it was finally determined to be him. buried on the grounds of Scotchtown in an unmarked grave. Chiswell's story and life struggles officially came to an end. His questionable chronicle reveals the scope of his suspect actions and the unsettling nature of his crimes, intertwined with numerous scandalous subplots. We may never uncover the true extent of the corruption embedded in the misconduct that defines his life and times. But one thing is evident: the story of Colonel John Chiswell will forever dwell in a lingering shadow of uncertainty.